in the town of Abiquiu, New Mexico. Actually, I'm a member of the community of the Monastery of Christ in the Desert. And the monastery itself is actually, about 40 minutes north of the little town of Abiquiu. Abiquiu is famous because those of you that are into art know that that's where Georgia O'Keeffe, the famous American artist Georgia O'Keeffe, spent most of her, I'll say, later years. She was our nearest neighbor when she was still alive, and she would frequently come and visit the monastery. The monastery itself is a Benedictine monastery, so we have a tradition that goes back more than 1,400 years. The Trappists we think of as Johnny-come-latelys. They split from the Benedictine community 1,100 years after we were founded. So just, what the heck. The monastery itself is unusual. It sits in the middle of a massive federal wilderness area. So our driveway is a 13-mile dirt road that takes you into the middle of this beautiful, beautiful country. If any of you have ever been to Sedona, Arizona, it looks just like that. We sit in a canyon that's about a half a mile wide. The cliffs go straight up 1,000 feet, and right through the middle of the monastery essentially runs the Chama River, which is a major tributary of the Rio Grande. So in order to get to the monastery, if you're coming from Albuquerque or Santa Fe, you actually have to cross the Rio Grande to get to us. At the monastery, we are also, in addition to making beer, brewing beer, we're also growing hops. And in fact, in the brewing, several years ago, I was actually asked to write an academic paper and do an academic lecture for what that's worth. I was asked to talk a little bit about my background. Yeah, okay. Oh, well, that I could talk about all night, just like you guys could. Let me start. I actually am the product, my father was a third-generation West Point graduate. And like my father, in 1968, followed him into the Army, did my normal tours in Vietnam and Europe, and at some point, and then went directly to the DMZ in Korea, and after literally 26 straight months of people shooting at me, said, there's got to be a better way of making a living. So I left the Army, went back to graduate school, and got an MBA. My undergraduate degrees are basically in chemistry. I have a master's degree in chemistry also, which really helps if you're a brewer. And then spent a lot of time, just like you guys did, out in the working world. I've only been at the monastery for about 10 years. I spent 30 years living in Portland, Oregon. Literally watched the entire craft brewing industry grow up in Portland. Know a lot of the people that were founders of the breweries there. While they were off having fun, I was busy doing technology companies and building technology companies. And at some point I said, there's got to be something better in life than this. And about 10 years ago, moved down to New Mexico and became associated with the monastery. I am technically what's called an oblate of the monastery, which means I'm a member of the community. I've taken the same vows that the normal, my brothers take in the community, but I don't live in the community because I have to go back and forth. I actually live in Santa Fe because I have to go back and forth between two different breweries. At the monastery itself, we have a brewery, but it's a small pilot brewery because there is no frickin' way you're going to get an 18-wheel vehicle down a 13-mile dirt road with 180-degree switchbacks in it. We can barely get the propane truck down that road, especially in the winter. And that road, when it rains hard, it turns to adobe mud. Good luck, okay? And when it's not raining, it's hard as a rock. And so we run that brewery where we do all the development work. We do small batches. All the beer there is racked off in kegs. And then we have another brewery down in Moriarty, New Mexico, which is about 30 miles east of Albuquerque on Route 66, historic Route 66. And there we've got a full bottling line, et cetera. We actually share that brewery. That is a true alternating proprietorship with a young couple, well, young relative to me, that runs Sierra Blanca Brewing. And Rich and Suzanne run that brewery, and they're beautiful brewers. So, how did I get into brewing? Gosh, well, when you grow up in a military family, you constantly move. The first memories I have are basically living in Spain and Portugal and Germany, where my father was the military attaché in the embassies. So I also love my wine in addition to my beers, and never stopped enjoying them. Obviously, as an undergraduate, and when I wasn't in the monastery, like many of you, was a home brewer, was fascinated by it. Probably one of the great highlights of my life was when I was a young second lieutenant. I was stationed in Bamberg, Germany. So those of you that know brewing know that there are a couple of things about Bamberg, Germany. One is it is the home of one of the great malting houses in the world, and the other is that it has this unique beer that is still one of my favorite beers, and I die for it. When I went there in 1968, it was because of the first Czech Revolution that was going on, and it was not a very happy time to be on the border where East Germany, West Germany, and Czechoslovakia came together. So I moved down to New Mexico. Benedictine monasteries follow the rule of St. Benedict, which means we have to earn our own living. We don't beg for money. We're supposedly not allowed to do that, although we do take donations. And so we have to figure out how to do that. Well, that's hard to do when you're located essentially in the middle of a federal wilderness area. And so about 11 years ago, 12 years ago, the community came up with the idea of, well, why don't we start a brewery? And we were very fortunate. We had a patron, Dr. David Gonzalez, who wrote a nice check for us, $100,000, and we literally have bootstrapped the whole operation up from that. So the brewery today, we're a small brewery. We have about a 2,000 barrel capacity. That's it. And like many of the Trappist breweries in Europe, we're in this to support ourselves and support some of the charitable work that we do in connection with this. We have responsibility for a couple of monasteries in Mexico. We have a responsibility for a couple of monasteries in the U.S. We're like the parent monastery, as it were. It's actually called a mother house. And we have canonical responsibility for a monastery in South Africa, actually. So we're spread pretty thin. There are about 40 members of the community. So in 2005, we brewed our first beer. We were very fortunate to have, living in New Mexico at the time, Brad Krause, who is our master brewer. Brad's been brewing beer for 40 years. He's a graduate of Rice University. Like me, he's a chemistry guy. And he was fortunate enough when he came out of Rice to go to work for Pierre Celis. Those of you that know your wit beers know that Pierre Celis basically is the father of wit beers in America, and that's exactly what this is. Don't worry, if you don't convert, the trap doors will not open. Okay? But we do hope you enjoy the beers. This is a fascinating time to be in this business because of the number of breweries that are being started and the number of terrific brewers that are being developed, both men and women. We're very fortunate in New Mexico to have some terrific brewers. New Mexico last week took home 6 medals. Which is pretty amazing. And last year, Ted Rice at Marble was the Brewer of the Year, Brewery of the Year. Speaking of IPAs, Jeff Irway, who runs La Cumbre, won both the World Gold and the GABF Gold back-to-back for his IPA. So we're blessed. What's interesting is a lot of those brewers were students of our head brewer, Brad Krause. Brad is literally down in Panama building breweries, in Panama and Ecuador and Colombia, actually. So he, have mash tun, will travel. All right, so the wit. This is a classic Belgian wit. You'll notice that this is fairly clear. It's not as opaque as you would want it to, but that's the way Brad wants it brewed, so that's the way we do it. This happens to be 5.4%. It is a beer that we've brewed. This is actually the second beer we developed, actually. And when we start to develop a beer, it takes us about a year to develop the beer. Because of Brad's heritage and having grown up and been a student of Pierre Celis, who actually brought this style back, what we've done with this beer is work very, very hard to maintain the integrity of what Pierre Celis wanted. So some examples of that. Most brewers that are making this beer put coriander in it. There are actually two types of coriander in the world. The most common coriander you can get is Egyptian coriander. That's the round stuff that you see. That's what most brewers use. We worked very hard to go find Indian coriander. Indian coriander is shaped like a little tiny football, and that's how you know the difference. And it's not common in this country. We actually finally found someone that can supply it in bulk out of California, believe it or not. Another difference is these beers typically have both sweet and bitter orange peel. So here's a pop quiz question. Where does almost all of the bitter orange peel come from? Pardon? Nope. Believe it or not, the bitter orange peel that all of us use comes from Haiti. How about that for bizarre? Now, the sweet orange peel, we are actually getting from Spain. Again, most brewers in the U.S., you can get orange peel out of California, out of Florida, et cetera, et cetera. But the particular variety we're using comes out of Spain itself. So again, this is this effort to try and maintain the tradition, essentially, of what Pierre did. Our beer does have, how should I say it, a few other magic ingredients. There are two spices in our beer. One is chamomile, which is not uncommon in these beers, and the other spice will remain a trade secret. Okay? This is a nice, clean beer. Oh, jeez. Well, then the trap door would have to open. So, this beer uses, I'm just going to work here at, yeah, this is a standard SRM 4.6. I'm just looking at my notes here. IBU's 19, so not super high. It's a nice drinkable beer. We distribute now. Scott is actually our newest distributor, and this is as far away from the Southwest as we get. Okay, so our natural markets, as you would expect, the states that we're distributing into now are Southern California, Arizona, obviously New Mexico, our home state, Colorado, but especially the Front Range of Colorado. Here, and believe it or not, we have a distributor in Arkansas who loves the beer. So those are the main states that we're distributing into. And go ahead. Yeah. It is a lighter beer because it's got to stand up to Phoenix at 120 degrees in the middle of the summer. Okay. And it's almost a session beer in that sense. So any other questions about this particular beer? 5.4. 5.4. Yeah. Monk's Wit. All of our beers are going to start with monks. Surprise, surprise. And if you see it essentially in a package, on the label of the bottle and on the six-pack carrier is a picture of one of the monks from the community. So they are, in fact, real monks on the picture of the label. On the wit beer, actually, is my colleague, Brother Rodrigo. He originally was from Mexico. He's now a naturalized American citizen. Brother Rodrigo is one of the, I'll call them, handyman persons at the monastery. He also does and has responsibility for all the recycling we do and the sustainability efforts at the monastery. The monastery is totally off the grid. Yeah, that's Brother Rodrigo. Yeah. We're totally off the grid. All the buildings at the monastery are basically made out of adobe and straw bale. We have to run our own power system, which makes running the brewery sometimes a challenge. The brewery itself runs basically off solar power. We have to run our own water system. We have to run our own sanitation system. And we, as I said earlier, grow hops. So we're about as green as you can get when it comes to making the beers there. Okay, so all the beers you're going to taste tonight are going to follow essentially that 1,500-year tradition of monastic brewing, with one exception, the dark, which we developed because every time we'd go to a festival, we get asked the same question. Do you have an IPA? I'm quoted in the Los Angeles Times as saying, quote, monks don't brew IPAs. All right, so the concession is we have in our back pocket a beer I developed last year. I'm not sure when we'll produce it on large scale commercially, which is, how should I say it, a strong classic pale ale, okay? 50 IBUs, it's about 6.7% alcohol. It uses the hops we grow at the monastery. So, yeah. So the second question we always get is, so what do you got that's really light? And you go, what does that mean? Well, you know who that is. Those are the crossover people, all right? You know, they're coming off of the Mexican lagers or they're coming off of the domestic stuff. And they don't want to get the shock of an imperial stout, okay? And then the other question we get is, what do you got that's dark? Well, the problem with trying to brew dark beers in the Southwest is you got to brew a beer that hopefully you can get at least 3 seasons out of. So it took me about a year to develop the dark you're going to have. It doesn't fit any style guide, okay? So I'll just tell you that now. Don't ask, all right? Let's just say that I started with a couple of great British summer porters and sort of took it from there. So this tradition goes back 1,500 years. And anybody know why? Why have monks been brewing beer for 1,500 years? That's one good answer. Any other answers? Bingo. Okay. So the founder of our order is a guy by the name of Benedict of Nursia. Benedict lived from 480 until 547. And in his later years, he actually started 13 monasteries, the most famous of which is the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, the site of a tragic incident during World War II. The story there is that the Germans are smart enough to know that all of southern Germany is Roman Catholic, and so even Hitler had enough sense not to totally mess up with the Roman Catholic Church, because otherwise he'd be in deep yogurt. Monte Cassino, having been there, when you're at the top of that mountain and you're looking south, you can see you can almost see all the way to the end of the boot of Italy, for crying out loud. And the commitment was made by the Germans and announced to the Allies that they would not use that monastery essentially for any military purpose whatsoever. Nonetheless, the monks and the community there took the library, which was one of the greatest libraries in Europe, took all the artwork and everything, and essentially took it down the mountain and hid it. Unfortunately, the Allies didn't quite believe the story, and so they literally leveled it, bombed it down to basically dust. Since then, the monastery has been totally rebuilt. At the end of the war, actually before the end of the war, when the Allies essentially got to the monastery, the monks said, "Why did you do this? There have never been any Germans here." They kept their word. Okay, so it's one of the great tragedies of that war. But Benedict wrote a book. It's a very small red book called The Rule of St. Benedict. Now, he didn't write it from scratch. He borrowed from other writers, and that book is the book that guides our daily life. It is brilliantly written. Benedict was the son of a Roman noble person. He went to Rome to study, was totally disgusted. You got to remember that by the time he goes to Rome, the Roman Empire is starting to crumble. The level of decadence is somewhere off the chart. He said, this is not what I want to do. And so he went home and eventually became a hermit. He wrote this book, and it's a book about how to live in communities. And it's brilliantly written. It is very short, and it covers everything from how do you select monks to how do you get an abbot. This is almost heresy in the Roman Catholic Church. We elect our abbots. Nobody tells us who our abbot's going to be. We get to elect them. And they can be unelected. Okay? The opening line of the Rule of Benedict is something that all of us, even I, need to learn. Listen, my child, with the ear of your heart. Listen, my child, with the ear of your heart. And certainly our current Pope seems to embody that in a big way. Well, in that rule, Benedict wrote, "You will treat every visitor to your monastery as though they were the Christ." And that means I don't care what their background is, I don't care what their station in life is, I don't care what their spiritual tradition or no spiritual tradition is. And because of that, the charism, the gift of Benedictine communities is hospitality. And to this day, when you go to a Benedictine monastery, you're guaranteed three things. And in Benedict's day, these were all important. Number one, you were guaranteed safety. There were no interstates. It was very dangerous to travel. But when you appeared at a Benedictine monastery, you check your sword and your daggers and everything at the door. Yep, even you, Mr. King. Number two, you were guaranteed a place to sleep. Now, if you happen to be a traveling prince, you got the royal suite next to the abbot. And if you were a lowly serf, at least you got clean, dry hay in the barn. But you did not have to sleep out in the elements. And the third thing you were guaranteed was sustenance. Sustenance. And to this day, if you visit a Benedictine monastery, you get those three things. We operate 2 guest houses at our monastery. We never ask anybody to pay. There's sort of a suggested donation rate, but if somebody comes and wants to stay for a couple of days and can't afford to stay, we never ask. Okay? And it's part of that ongoing tradition that we have. Now, the answer was correct. At the beginning of the 6th century, would you have consumed the water out of any stream, any well, anything in Europe? No, you would have died. And so the Benedictines developed this tradition of, in places where they could brew beer, they brewed beer. In the warmer climates, they made wine. And in places like the Alps, they started making those beautiful liqueurs, actually. And of course, what they all have in common is either they're distilled or they're boiled, and so you could safely drink. Now, those beers also were very high in calories, very high in protein, and so they could be consumed essentially during a fasting period. And that's why it's called liquid bread. Okay, liquid bread. Do I have Oh! Okay. So this is the thank you. I kept waiting. You said you're going to put it in my hand, so I kept waiting. This is the ale. This is a very interesting beer. This is the first beer we developed. It's still the flagship beer. This beer is also called an enkel, a single, and sometimes it is called Pater's beer, father's beer. In the Benedictine monasteries that still brew in Europe and in the Belgian monasteries, they brew this beer. It never leaves the monastery. Okay? To my knowledge, there are only, us, the Trappists in Massachusetts are now making a variation of this. I think there are only 2 or 3 other breweries that make it. There may be some that I don't know about. Thank you. Well, this one's 5.2. Yeah. Okay, let me deal with the technical stuff, then I'll come back. Because I always get asked this story: how did the single and the double and the triple get its name? Okay, so let me talk about the technical aspects of this beer first. I just want to make sure that the trap door doesn't open under me. That would not be good. Indeed. All right, so this is this is 5.2% SRM. The color is 11. This is designed as a clear beer, a filtered beer. It's 27 IBU. In this particular beer, like all of our beers, typically we're using North American 2-row, and then the other barleys we're using are typically imported barleys. The hops in this beer are primarily Czech Saaz and the German Hallertauers, okay, are what are going into these beers, okay? Noble hops, yeah, it's a noble drink, of course. This beer, again, is a year-round. It's available year-round. We sell more of this than anything else. I once was in a class with the owner of this small brewery in Maine called Allagash, and it was a one-day class. It was a fascinating class because it was being conducted by one of the head professors from the Technical University of Bavaria, and the other guy was his competitor from the Catholic University in Louvain, and it was all about basically the wit beers, okay, or I should say wheat-based beers. There's a fascinating story about that, which I have time, I'll come tell you. How did wheat get into that beer? Very quickly. Easy. In southern Germany, the kings decided they were going to tax the brewer's barley. Well, they were already taxing everything else about making the beer and the beer itself. Well, heck, let's tax the barley. Well, so the brewer said, okay, fine, so we'll just start adding a little wheat. What happens if you try and tax the wheat? Cost of bread goes up. What happens if the cost of bread goes up? Monarchs tend to lose their heads. The Belgians came along later, and being smart, they passed a series of laws that essentially limited the amount of wheat. So typically in a Hefeweizen, you'll see in the grain bill up to about 60% of it will be wheat, whereas in the Belgian wits, only about 40% of it will be wheat. Okay? So that's one of the main differences that you get there. Now, let's come back and talk briefly about this enkel and how it's got its name. It actually traces itself back to an Irishman. Yeah, an Irishman, yeah. A guy by the name of St. Gall, G-A-L. And he started his career in Ireland in one of the great monasteries of Ireland. Eventually, he and 13 other guys came to Europe, and they ended up in Switzerland. And this is at the time of Charlemagne, the great Emperor Charlemagne, who was the first emperor to unite most of Western Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. All right. Charlemagne, good Catholic boy that he was, loved the fact that the Benedictines had this tradition of hospitality, and they had this tradition of peace. we as Benedictines, you say join the war or something, we run the other way. Okay, I mean we're just like Quakers. Okay, it's like we don't. And in fact, when you go into the living space of any monastery, above it you will see the word pax, P-A-X, peace. Okay. So when you go into our private living space, we're reminded of that every time we come and go out of our living space. So Charlemagne's son, who eventually took over the empire, he decided that this was a good thing, and so he wanted to promote this Benedictine spirituality, which is its own spirituality all over Europe. And so he took the monastery that was started after St. Gall died, that's outside present-day Geneva, Switzerland. The monastery of St. Gall, it's now a UN World Heritage Site. And he said that's going to be an imperial monastery. Ooh, boy. And what he did was, he was way ahead of the notion of franchising. He sent his scribes into that monastery to literally document everything about a monastery, so he then had a blueprint. And so if somebody said, we want to start a monastery, he said, great, here's the cookbook, go start a monastery. All right? And in that we have one of the best descriptions of brewing beer essentially in the early Middle Ages. And we also know that they pioneered, or at least it's the first written record we have of some innovations in the beer. So it's the first time, for instance, they're using metal containers instead of wood vessels, and you throw hot rocks in it. Okay? It's the first time they clearly separate, essentially, and they start to separate the mash tuns from the lauter tuns from the kettle. Okay? And it's beautifully done. They're diagrams. It's beautiful. And what they would do is, and it was also totally vertically integrated. Okay? So for those of you that are good capitalists and understand that concept, I mean, they grew the grain, they did everything. And so what they would do is they would take the grains and they would crush them, as we do today. They'd basically put them into steep, all right? And of course, those grains produce the highest level of alcohol, right? Because you're going to get the most sugar out of it. And that beer, that first draw, went into kegs, and on the end of the keg, guess what they put? 3 X's, called, hey folks, this is the high gravity stuff. Okay? And that beer was reserved for the princes of the church, the nobility. I mean, it's the 1% guys, okay? It's the 1% crowd, okay? Well, these are monks. We're frugal. Hey, man, just put more hot water in. Steep it again. And they would. Guess what that produced? 2 X's, a Dubbel. And who got that beer? Well, the tradespeople, the people that still had their independence, etc. But hey, man, that beer is way too good for the common ordinary monk. We're into, how should I say it, austerity and humility. Okay. So they would do it again, and that third draw produced the Enkel. And of course, it had the lowest gravity. Now, that's the story. That's the legend. Today, if you look at, and going back to the late 1800s, as the Trappists were revising or rebuilding these brands, that's not what we do, believe me. Each one stands its own test and has its own formula, has its own ingredients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the tradition. Okay? So, actually, I have here something very unique, because I only brought one, okay? And for knowing that answer, you get to be the double winner tonight. Okay? That's a memory key. Because very, very few people know how these beers got their story. Okay, so now we have the dark. Okay? Yep, passed that test, didn't it? Oh, I love this stuff. People often ask me, what's my favorite beer? And I will look at them and say, because most of the time people will be married, they have children, and I say, that's like asking you who your favorite child is. you're never going to admit anything in public. But I got to tell you, this I can drink a lot of. So this beer was developed, about a year ago. It was in response to the question of what do you got that's dark, but we also needed a beer that could be consumed year-round, okay? And so I just started playing around. It took about a year to develop this beer. So the technicalities of this beer are it's 6.5% ABV. You can tell now I'm starting, after 10 years, I'm starting the siren song, okay, of bigger and bolder and stronger and more alcohol. Okay, fine. I'm getting there. This is a 24.5 IBU. We're using a variety of caramel malts. I've got some chocolate malt in here. I've got some black malts in here. Standard two-row stuff. The predominant, let's see, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. I'm using Magnum as a bittering hop because it's a neutral hop. Because I wanted a little more IBU in this to balance out essentially the malt-forward character of it. And then the other hops we're using are, what did I put in here? Oh, yeah, okay. So British Fuggle is the other dominant hop in here, okay? Oh, sure. So the guy on this bottle, he's very interesting. This is Brother Francis Martinez. Brother Francis, like many of us, has an interesting story. He was actually born and raised in Lima, Peru. Came to the United States, was educated in Southern California, actually has a Master in Fine Arts from USC, and came to the monastery fairly late in his life. He was in his early 40s. And had been a brilliant artist and designer. We have a monastery that we're the mother house of outside San Miguel de Allende in Mexico. And those of you that know Mexico know that that's where the muy rico live, okay? As you drive from the city square out to the monastery, you'll go past these small fincas. And the way the people commute to Mexico City, they've got their private helicopter sitting there. Okay, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so Carlos Slim owns an entire city block, and now we're talking about the 1% of the 1%. Okay, but Brother Francis had a partner, and he went and started researching. The classic colonial arts and crafts, and developed a thriving business, essentially reproducing and designing everything from furniture to you name it. Okay? So his Rolodex of craftspeople in that part of the world is unbelievable, and a lot of his art is around our monastery. You go into the main refectory is our word for a dining room. These beautiful light fixtures he designed and had built for us. Okay. He also is a wonderful gardener, by the way. He's got 4 green thumbs. Brother Martinez, Francis Martinez. Francis. Yes? That is, he's technically called the prior, and it's Christian Leisy. So Christian Leisy, Leisy. Christian Leasy's Christian Leasy's family owned and operated Abbey Brewing in Cleveland. And they were the dominant brewers in Cleveland until the late 60s, when all the consolidation going on. So Brother Leisy, Brother Christian, prior Christian, literally has beer in his veins. Okay? And he has been an incredible supporter of what we're doing. He's pretty introverted and doesn't like to travel, but he'll jump on an airplane in a heartbeat to come help support the beers. We call him a monk's monk. I get chills when I think about Brother Christian. He was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, And like our abbot, by the way, those of you that haven't seen it, the current issue of Craft Brewing is all about Belgian beers, all right? And living here in St. Louis now is a guy by the name of Stan Hieronymus. Those of you that know Stan Hieronymus has written a bunch of books. Stan used to live in New Mexico. And he talks about the fact that there's now a third monastery that's brewing beer, and it's Mount Angel in Oregon. Brother Christian started his career as a monk at age 18 at Mount Angel. That's also where he went to seminary and was ordained as a priest, as did our abbot. Our abbot, Abbot Philip, was born and raised primarily in eastern Washington. Guess where? Around Yakima. So even as young monks, when they were at Mount Angel, guess what they did? In those days, Mount Angel owned extensive hop yards. So when I came to them and said, why don't we start growing our own hops? They went, okay, that's something we know about. Because when we were young monks, we would go work the hop yards. And in fact, Abbot Philip was the guy who was responsible for bagging the hops, compressing them into these 800-pound bales. And he said to me one day, he said, yeah, by the time you got to the end of the harvest season, your jeans would be so infused with oil that you'd take them off at night and you'd stand them up. Okay? And at the end of the brewing season, you threw a match at them and they just spontaneously combusted, okay? Because they had so much hop oil in them, which is a wonderful story, which is how we eventually got started in this. Okay, so this is, where to go? Here's my Dubbel. Yeah. So this is the Dubbel. This is probably, from a taste profile, the most complex taste profile we're making. It has in it sort of the secret recipe in here. To make these beers well, you're going to use Belgian candied syrup. Okay? And most of you know that there are two common grades, D1 and D2. Okay? Those are the two common grades. Well, it turns out that those aren't the only grades. Belgian candied syrup is the result of the process of extracting, essentially, and producing sugar from beet sugar. It's like the molasses of beet sugar. Yes? No. That is Brother Bernard. He is 84 years old. That's a very common question. The good news is I'm the guy behind the camera, so I never have to worry about ending up on a bottle someday. The picture I'm really holding, I have this terrific picture of Abbot Philip. And I'm waiting till I can sneak it onto a label and not have to ask permission. Okay? Abbot Philip has a wonderful sense of humor. I started to put it on the wit as an inside joke, but he found out about it and said, no. Well, one of the vows I took is obedience, and so all I can say is, yes, Abbot Philip, okay, you won't be on the wit bottle, okay? End of that. But I'm saving it. I'm not sure how I'm going to use it. Brother Bernard literally is 84. He is still as sharp as a tack, and he will come up to the brewery and do whatever he can, okay? So believe me, he has all of his mental faculties. He's as spry as can be. Unfortunately, in the last 2 years, he's started to lose some of his eyesight. Okay, so that's welcome to old age. Okay, but yeah, I plead innocent on that one. Okay, all right. So the Dubbel. Oh yeah. Well, what we do is we had a professional photographer come up and take pictures of almost all the brothers. We have about 40 members in the community. We have people waiting to come try the life. Many come, few stay. Okay, the total process of becoming a monk takes about 6 years. From the time we first say, "Yep, come try the life," until you take what we call your final vows. Okay, it's about a 6-year period. Okay, what was the question? Who's on the picture? Thank you. So we did that, and then of course we went through and we said, scowl, ooh, that's a possibility. And then what happens is actually Brother Christian and myself and the abbot sort of decide. Okay. So I've got more sitting, ready to go. And we always make it a surprise, okay? I'll talk about the guy who's on the Tripel, okay, because that's a fun story. The Dubbel, as I said, has Belgian candy syrup. I'm using a combination there of D1 and another grade that is not even brought into this country. I have to go to my colleagues in Europe and have it imported, essentially. It would be like a D3. It's a very dark molasses. It's, you stick a spoon in it and it stands up straight. It doesn't come in the normal big plastic container. It comes in a container where you pry the top off because it's so viscous, okay? The other thing we're doing with this is I'm using I'm using 2 different grades of yeast to try and get that blended grade. People ask, where do our yeast come? We're pretty much using commercial yeasts that are available from White Labs, Y Yeast, et cetera, okay? We have not gone down the path of develop. If I was 20 years younger, I would ask the abbot if I could go back and get another master's degree, in this case in microbiology, because I'm fascinated by the yeast. Yes? Okay, so why 2 grades of yeast? Because the profile that we were looking for, we couldn't get out of any of the commercially available grades, and so Brad Krause and I put our heads together and said, we like the characteristics of this one, we like the characteristics of this one, and we do use a 2-step fermentation process there before we do the traditional diacetyl rest. And sure enough, experimenting. Brad and I sometimes will debate, should we change the fermentation temperature by 1 degree Fahrenheit? Because we know, it'll have a profound effect. And this beer took us about 18 months to develop. I probably did 15 or 16 batches of this, okay? And then what we do is, we'll rack it off, and I'll take it to festivals, because the acid test is you guys, okay? I'll take it to festivals, and I'll serve it all summer at festivals. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about all the results we got and the comments we got, and we'll tweak it again, hopefully once, sometimes twice, and then we'll take it out the next spring, and then we know that it's pretty much ready. And then we'll scale up the recipe. The recipe doesn't scale up linearly from literally our small 1-barrel system up to basically a 20-barrel system. So then we might have to tweak it one more time when we scale it up to take it down to the big brewery, okay? But yeah, it's the characteristics of what we want. And that's why I'm fascinated by the yeast. Those little critters, there's still so much we don't know about what they do. What the heck. So, okay. Yeah. Well, these are more of an acquired taste. By the way, when our colleagues come last year, we had a meeting and we had 5 European abbots, 3 of them from those famous breweries. And what did they stuff their suitcases full of? The Dubbel and the Tripel. Okay. They said, wow, we love this stuff. We're going to take it back. I'm saying, wait a minute, you guys are making some of the best doubles and triples in the world. I'm a rank amateur compared to what you guys are doing, but they love this beer. The criticisms of this beer typically are, in America, because we're so used to hop bombs. Oh, this beer is too sweet. Okay. Or they'll say, oh, it's not dry enough. So those are the two common criticisms. And then we're going, yeah, you're right. This is the way we designed it. Exactly what we wanted, to follow that tradition.
Considering how sweet they are, I feel like they're a little bit drier than you would expect.
Yeah.
Considering the sweetness.
The other thing I will tell you that Scott knows is these beers age incredibly well. So, you know, this beer really comes into its own when it's been sitting for 6 months or so. Okay, they just smooth out, they mellow out. In fact, this one is a fairly old. I know what batch this is, so it's had a chance to sort of smooth out a little bit. Okay, in its process.